What's up, gifted family? Welcome to another episode of the show that is the GP YouTube. Just a reminder that if you support what we do here, make sure to go over to giftedperformance.com and sign up for our automated coaching service. For only $1 a day, you'll get access to 15 highly customized training programs, a macronutrient calculator, our meal planning feature that lets you build and save meals based on your macros, as well as access to our private Facebook group. All subscriptions help us in continuing to put out great content to get you to your fitness goals. Thanks for stopping by, and without any further delay, let's get into today's video. Enjoy.
All right, so into the presentation today. It's like Christina Aguilera said, it's what a girl wants, what a girl needs. A little bit of men versus women, sex differences in response to resistance training. So basically we're just going to look at some of the research into different areas where men and women differ when it comes to not only their predisposition to excel at resistance training, aerobic training, things like that, but also their responses to that. So how fast do they recover? Improvements in body image and muscle mass, things like injury rate, all the considerations that you have to make as you go into a resistance training program for both men and women. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. So the first thing and the most obvious difference that we see between men and women when it comes to resistance training is going to be muscle mass. And it's not a controversial topic to say that women have less muscle mass than men do. Women have roughly 2/3, around 65% is what the data shows of the muscle mass of men. And the disparity is going to be a lot larger in the upper body. So women have around 50% of the upper body muscle mass that men do, and that's at baseline. Now, the differences in muscle mass at baseline are largely going to be explained by differences in sex hormones, specifically testosterone. And if you want to see this advantage, or when this kind of advantage really takes off, all you have to really do is look at young boys and young girls before they hit puberty. If you look at the musculature of a young boy who is prepubescent and a young girl, what you'll notice is they're roughly the same in terms of muscle mass. And oftentimes, a young girl may actually be a little bit more muscular, a little bit faster, a little bit stronger, be able to throw a ball a little bit harder than a young boy. But when puberty hits and young boys get that big spike in testosterone, young girls get that big spike in estrogen, we start to see the advantages differentiate themselves. So men or young boys take off in terms of how much muscle mass, and then they reap all the athletic benefits of that. So testosterone explains that big advantage. Now, the strength differences, when we look at differences in strength between men and women, again, men are going to outperform women when we look at absolute strength. So men are going to be able to throw things further, lift heavier things, and the largest component of that is going to be explained by those differences in muscle mass. Now, when it gets interesting is when you equate for cross-sectional area. And what I mean by cross-sectional area is we take a look at the actual size of a muscle. So we shoot samurai sword, cut right through the muscle, and we actually look at the cross-section to determine how big the muscle actually is. Now, if we were to take a male muscle and a female muscle, and they were the exact same cross-sectional area, if we equated for cross-sectional area, what we would see is that those strength differences disappear. Around 97%, bottom bullet point here, 97% variance in strength between men and women can be explained for by FFW, so fat-free weight, and FFCSA, which would be fat-free cross-sectional area. So what does this tell us? It tells us that cross-sectional area or contractile tissue is contractile tissue. There is no male version of muscle and female version of muscle. There is only human muscle. Men just happen to have more of it because of the sex hormone difference. Therefore, they reap that strength advantage. Now, when we look at cross-sectional area advantage in men, because again, they have that larger muscle, we see this difference in both type 1, your oxidative fibers, and type 2, your glycolytic fibers, or your fast and your slow twitch fibers there. So men are going to have a greater cross-sectional area in both of those. Now, women tend to have a greater percentage or a greater proportion of type 1, your slow twitch muscle fibers, and those also have a lower absolute hypertrophic potential. So that means that they can grow the least. When we look at what muscle fiber types grow the most when we subject them to resistance training, we see that type 2 muscle fibers grow very fast and they grow very large. Type 1 muscle fibers start small. They grow at relatively the same rate, but they end up small just because of their lower starting point. So not only do women start with less muscle mass, they also have a larger percentage of the certain type of muscle fiber, the type 1 muscle fibers, that do not grow as much on an absolute scale as type 2. So those are your main differences in muscle mass between men and women. Now, when we shift into how does the muscle actually function, we look at the contractile properties of muscle, we see that, again, absolute force generation, strength, the ability to express power are going to be greater in men. And that is, of course, explained by that advantage in fat-free cross-sectional area. They have a greater amount of contractile tissue, greater amount of those myosin and actin that are causing that force production during a contraction. Now again, if we equate for that fat-free cross-sectional area, we create a scenario where it's a man and a woman who have the exact same amount of fat-free cross-sectional area, those differences completely disappear. And women who have a greater fat-free cross-sectional area than men, we look at like the Chinese Olympic weightlifting team, these women that have very, very large quad muscles can actually outperform untrained or less trained men. If you want some quick inspiration, there's an 89 plus kilo Chinese weightlifter who the other day posted a nice 500-pound triple on the back squat. Sweet. Now, speed of contraction and time to relaxation is another property of muscle that we want to look at here. And like we discussed on the previous slide, men have a greater proportion of type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers, they're called fast twitch because they twitch fast. They contract very quickly, and they also relax very quickly. So if we're comparing speed of contraction and time to relaxation within the muscle between men and women, we see that men, again, have that advantage there. However, as soon as this turns into an endurance bout or repeated contraction, women start to get a little bit of an advantage here. Because those muscle fibers, the type 2 muscle fibers, in men are contracting faster, relaxing faster, getting more contractions per unit time, that means that they are also fatiguing faster. And we'll talk a lot about fatigue resistance, in which women have a much greater advantage over their male counterparts. Now, if we look at torque, force production, again, just like the first bullet point, we're going to see that men have the advantage there. But when we get into repeated maximal contractions, we have to draw somewhat of a line in the sand, because this is where women start to have a serious advantage. So women, despite the fact that they cannot create as much force with a single muscular contraction, they will produce a greater percentage of their maximal force over repeated efforts. So let's put this into some math. Let's say a woman contracts her quadricep muscle and produces 100 newtons of force. The next contraction she may produce 95, then she may produce 90, and then 85, and then 80. Each time there's another contraction, the force production drops off by, we'll say, a nominal number of 5 units. Whereas the male, they may start at 200, so a higher initial force, but they're dropping off by 20 or 30, so they're going 200, 170, 140, so a greater absolute drop off and a greater fatigue component there for males. So when we look at relative endurance, so how far did you drop from that start point, women have the advantage. When we look at absolute endurance, men have the advantage, because despite the fact that they fatigue faster, they can still maintain a greater force production because of the larger muscle fibers. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here with fatigue resistance. So absolute endurance, maintaining a higher force for a longer period of time, favors males, despite the greater fatigue component. Relative endurance, 100% favors women. They can maintain a higher percentage of maximal force output over longer periods of time. So what are some practical takeaways here? Where does the advantage act? Where do you see the advantages in practice? Men are going to have an advantage in short burst, high intensity exercise, so sprint activities or power or force activities, maybe even on something like a Wingate test right here, if you're measuring maximum force output and that initial phase of the Wingate. and women are going to have an advantage in all things endurance. So as you protract the event out a little bit longer, we get into the longer time domains, women will be able to maintain a higher percentage of their original performance over the course of the entire event. And again, remember that these are relative and not absolute advantages. I'm not saying that women are going to outperform men in endurance events. And if you don't believe me there, look at whatever the next marathon coming up is, the Boston Marathon, New York Marathon, whatever it is. Look at the fastest times. The men will outperform the women because they still have that advantage in absolute endurance. But if we take relative intensity and we hold it constant over something like a resistance training session, we say, all right, you guys are going to perform at 80% of your 1 rep max, and I'm going to give you 5 sets to do as many reps as you possibly can. The woman is going to outperform the man because the man is going to fatigue significantly faster. So we throw 80% of their max on the bar. The woman gets 8 reps and then 7 reps, 6 reps. They're dropping by 1 rep each time. Whereas the male, they put 80% on the bar, they get 8 reps, and then they get 6 reps, and then they get 2 reps, and then they get 1 rep. We see a significantly faster drop off in terms of performance over the course of a workout for men. And this is largely due to the fact that there's a higher percentage of type 1 fibers in women. Those low fatigue fibers, or the fatigue resistant fibers, I should say. And then when we get into kind of some more of the dynamics of the actual muscle itself, in a type 1 fiber, there's greater capillary density, meaning that we can deliver more blood flow to the muscle, which in turn then means that we can deliver more fuel, things like oxygen, substrate, fatty acids, glucose, things like that, and then remove waste as well, CO2, all the metabolites of muscular contraction. Moving right along. Another advantage that women have here is going to be a roughly 40% higher plasma fatty acid concentration than men, as well as a large advantage in proteins that shuttle fatty acids into the mitochondria. So they have a greater amount of fuel to use in aerobic metabolism, as well as a greater concentration of the proteins needed to shuttle those oxidative fuels into the mitochondria. So twofold advantage right there. So the more oxidative a bout of exercise over time, the more it's going to favor women. Now, some other things that people often wonder about in terms of men versus women in the gym would be something like injury rates. So how often do women get injured in resistance training? How often do men get injured in resistance training? And the problem here is that there's not a ton of research that directly compares male versus female injury rates. There's a lot of data, just an absolute plethora of data that looks at the different resistance training domains. So it compares things like field sports to strongman, to powerlifting, to Olympic weightlifting, to bodybuilding, and we compare the injury rates between those, but there's not so much that looks at just male versus female. So I did find one meta-analysis, one systematic review of the literature that looked at male versus female injury rates, and it showed kind of what you would expect. Men on average get injured more often in resistance training than women do. And some interesting takeaways, or some interesting speculation from the research, was that it may be more of a choice of activity. And to put this to wrap your head around this, go into your local gym, and the preponderance of women are using what piece of equipment? They're using more so machines. This is becoming less and less true as time goes along, and as we're kind of removing the stigma around strength training in women, but it still is true to this day that women tend to are more inclined or are more drawn to the machines, whereas men, ego-driven individuals, we like to go over to the free weight and usually load it a little bit too heavy. So is this a choice of activity? Is it approach to training? And are these absolute versus relative numbers? So we do know that still there are more men participating in resistance training than there are women. So when we see injury rates, and we're just looking at absolute numbers, 10,000 men or whatever it was get injured every single year versus 5,000 women get injured every single year. Are those numbers absolute, or are we comparing that to the total number of individuals actually partaking in resistance training? It's an important distinction to draw. The authors did conclude that men suffer a greater number of exertion-based injuries. Very funny way or nice way of saying that it's ego lifting. So these over-exertion injuries, it's the cat back deadlift with 500 pounds on the bar to impress everyone else at the gym. Who do you see doing that? mostly the largest proportion is going to be men doing that. Women suffer a greater number of accidental injuries. I'm not 100% sure what to read into that in terms of why that may be the case, but the authors definitely wanted to note that. They said that a couple times. And then they broke it down kind of by body part as well. The most common body part that was injured, whether male or female, was the trunk or the spine. I'm assuming, or the core or the trunk. I'm assuming a lot of those were going to be lower back injuries. Probably from poor lifting mechanics, if I had to guess. And when we compare the sexes, men are injuring their trunk, their lower back more often, whereas women injure the foot and leg at greater rates. So again, are these trends activity choice based? Are they ego lifting based? You can read into it what you want in terms of why maybe women injure their foot and leg. Maybe these are overuse injuries from choosing running, jogging, things like that, as opposed to the men that are hurting their lower back because maybe they're overexerting themselves on the bench press, squat, deadlift, things like that. So if I had to speculate, I would say that it's probably activity choice based. That's why we're seeing these certain trends, and that it's not that the genders or the sexes are driving you towards one type of injury or the other. Now we'll talk a little bit about brain health and effective exercise on cognition, another area where there's not a ton of research in the men versus women. There is a ton of research on exercise and cognition, and a lot of it is in the elderly, and we're looking at what effect does exercise have on cognition in neurodegeneration, so things like Alzheimer's, depression, late stage stuff that happens to you when you get a little bit older as you kind of lose some of that brain health. So a lot of good stuff here, really a ton of good stuff, a lot of good evidence showing that exercise in the elderly can benefit their brain health. But when we look at male versus female, I found one systematic review. If you found some others, or if you know of some others, please either drop those in the comments. You can send an email to me directly at giftedperformance@gmail.com, or you can send it to me directly on Instagram at @the_squadfather. And in this systematic review, the authors concluded the data that they found showed that women benefit more than men from different exercise interventions when it comes to cognition. So they used different modalities, and they wanted to see what different benefits they actually had. So they used a group that did aerobic, a group that did resistance, and a group that did mixed modal exercise. When you hear mixed modal, think of something that combines the resistance training with the aerobics. The study looked at a variety of mental health or of cognitive factors. So they looked at executive function, things like memory, word fluency, processing speed, all different aspects of cognition. And what they found was that women showed a greater improvement across all domains. So they exercised, they had their exercise intervention, whether it be 8, 12 weeks, whatever it may be, measured at the end, and women outperformed men, or they improved more than men did. The aerobic training side of things favored global cognitive and executive function, whereas the multimodal training favored episodic memory and word fluency. The authors concluded by saying they weren't 100% sure why exactly they saw these changes, but they speculated that it had something to do with sex steroid hormones and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So what we really need to do here is do some sort of further research on subjecting both men and women to exercise, seeing what happens with sex steroid hormones, as well as measuring brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and then seeing if that's actually what explains. This is an area relatively in its infancy from what I found in the research. Definitely more needed there to conclude and say for sure that women are going to benefit more cognitively from exercise than men are. What about good old body image? So I found a good amount of data on body image and the response to training adaptations, and as you might suspect, body image improves in both men and women post-training adaptations. The key there is that there needs to be some sort of adaptation to training, some sort of tangible, something that you can grab onto to say, I improved here, and that's why my body image has improved. But from there, it got a lot more interesting in terms of what I found in the research. So subjective and objective measures showed significant changes in both men and women. So body fat went down, strength went up, sense of well-being improved, how you felt about your own appearance, your reduced social physique anxiety, you're more likely to tear your shirt off at the pool, things like that. A lot of these subjective and objective measures showed significant changes after some sort of training intervention. But when we get into the differences between the sexes, that's when it gets a little bit interesting here. So the men, from the research that I saw, appear to see body image changes sooner. So they had a quicker time course before their body image improved, and they didn't need as many objective changes as women did to kind of feel that body image change. So the subjective physical changes appeared to hold more weight than in women. So perception of self, opinions, positive self-talk, self-efficacy, all of those improved quicker with physical changes. So the men did reap a benefit from the physical changes, but they saw body image improve with more subjective measures than women did. The women appear to have more of a lag time in body image changes, so there was a longer period of time before they reported that their body image improved. When you include objective measures, or when the researchers included objective measures, things like strength, women saw a boost in body image. So it appeared from the data that they sampled that the women preferred the objective stuff, the tangible stuff, the stuff that they could feel and they could see on a sheet of paper. I used to squat 135 and now I squat 155. That's something that I can hold on to, and that's something that makes me feel better about myself and improves my body image. However, the subjective physical changes were also very important in women. So clothes fitting a little looser, seeing the improvements in the mirror, all of that was also important to women. So from this research that I found here, I thought a very interesting practical takeaway might be that men respond quicker and didn't need the same amount of objective things to look at to see an improvement in body image, where with your female clients, it might be better to include a few more objective measures that improve relatively quickly so that we can see a boost in body image right away. So with women, maybe don't just use the scale as a marker of success. Use things like measurements, 1RMs, other objective measures that they can see in front of them and hold and say, wow, I'm improving quite a bit here, and that will improve body image a little bit faster. So an interesting little takeaway from the authors and that piece of research right there. All right, now some more kind of adaptation to training stuff. When we look at muscle damage, it appears that men suffer a greater amount of muscle damage than women do, and that is in the both subjective and objective domains. In the objective domain, we measure things like creatine kinase. So creatine kinase being a great blood marker for muscle damage. Put men and women through the exact same bout of damaging exercise, whether it be 50 maximal eccentric contractions of the bicep, whatever kind of damaging protocol you want to give them, men are going to have higher levels of creatine kinase or values. The most likely explanation for this would be muscle size. Men have greater muscle, more muscle to damage, therefore there's going to be greater muscle damage markers. Some less concrete stuff, but some stuff that may have also be of value. Force output, the muscle is generating more force, therefore it's going to suffer more muscle damage. It's another theory that I saw in the research. And then that maintenance of that greater force output. So greater force from contraction number one and greater force for each preceding contraction moving down the line. Does that cause more muscle damage? I have seen that theory floated around. Men are also going to experience or report a greater or a higher level of subjective pain or delayed onset muscle soreness post-exercise. So when you give them these subjective qualitative surveys of, hey, how sore do you feel in your quads after this workout that we give you? Men, it appears, report that they have higher levels of subjective DOMs than women do. Now, women are going to experience a greater relative strength loss immediately post-exercise. So you put them through a damaging protocol, and then you have them max out. They're going to have a greater relative strength loss than men. It appears that men hold on to and can perform at a higher strength level immediately post-exercise. But as soon as we get into a 24, 48, 72-hour window, as opposed to the immediately post-exercise window, it appears that women recover on an expedited time course. They're ready for another bout of exercise faster than men are, and their performance relative to their starting point will be higher than men. So what is the cause of this? Is it muscle damage related? Can we explain it by the lower creatine kinase values? We're not 100% sure at this point why this occurs. Could be muscle damage related, could be sex hormone related. Kind of let the research flesh that out. Why exactly it happens is not super important for the coach in the field, for the practitioner. It just matters more that you understand that it does happen so that you can take that practical little tidbit of knowledge and put it into your programming. So if we look at, got ahead of myself. If we look at something like substrate usage, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, women a lot more oxidative, have higher levels of plasma triglycerides. So I kind of gave myself away here. But when we look at substrate usage, it appears that women have a greater metabolic flexibility than men. They use a greater percentage of carbohydrate and store more fat in that postprandial period. So in that postprandial period, directly after a meal, it looks like they burn off glucose at a little bit of a faster rate and favor fat storage. And then during exercise, they oxidize more fat and spare more glycogen. Regardless of intensity, women are going to be more fat oxidative than their male counterparts. One theory that I did see floated around, and this was, I believe, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but this was in rat research. They saw that there was a greater concentration of estrogen receptors on mitochondria. The theory was that this will actually increase glucose uptake into the muscle, and this could improve metabolic health. So that type 2 diabetes rates are higher in men than women, despite the fact that women have a higher obesity rate than men. So this would kind of explain how maybe estrogen, and we see this in like heart health as well, estrogen seems to be cardioprotective. It looks like it may also just be metabolically protective in terms of type 2 diabetes as well. Take that for what you will. Do some of your own research on that one, but that looks like what the numbers are kind of pointing to. The exact explanation is something that I would leave up to our biochem guy, Heck Paez. Now, in the fasted state, so you wake up fresh out of bed, men and women are going to be metabolically identical. They oxidize almost the exact same percentage of carbohydrates and fat. During training, we talked about this, women burn a much higher amount of fat, whereas men favor glycolysis. Post-exercise, that flips on its head. Women rely more on carbohydrate, and men transition over to fat oxidation. So what's the practical takeaway here? Probably not a lot. This kind of just like evens itself out over time with that flipping of fat to carb and carb to fat for men versus women. Probably not a lot of takeaway in terms of what you need to do nutritionally. If you're just working with someone on a fat loss, weight loss, a bodybuilding prep or anything like that. Now, when you get into like advanced athletics, maybe it's endurance sports, then there's gonna be some special sports nutrition considerations that you need to take, but we'll leave those out of this video. We'll save those for another video. All right, some takeaways and some TLDR here. If you want the TLDR, if you prefer the written format, I recommend you go over to Stronger by Science. Greg Nuckols wrote a great article called Sex Differences in Training and Metabolism. The infographic on the right is directly from that article. A fantastic article that really does a good job of summing up the difference between men and women if you prefer that written format. So the takeaways here, men are going to start out with a large advantage in muscle mass and strength. Now with training, women can outperform men by quite a large margin. If you look at some of the top women Olympic weightlifters in the world, you look at someone like Kate Nye, who just cleaned 150 from the blocks, 150 kilos from the blocks. How many men do you know that are actually larger in size that can't clean or have never cleaned 150 kilos? This guy, I've never done that, and she is smaller than me. And so what that goes to show is that with training, women can easily outperform men. Women are more equipped to excel in endurance sports, and for a couple reasons, actually. They have a larger percentage of type 1 muscle fibers. Some more recent research is examining if this remains true for women who train in strength and power sports. So the idea was always that women excel in endurance sports because they're more likely, but with more research looking into how muscle fiber types transition over the course of a training career, we're starting to think that maybe this might not be the case for strength and power sports with training in women. So women can easily keep up with / outperform men in the strength and power events, if you equate for muscle size, of course. But women are far more resistant to fatigue. just boom, right down the line. Women get injured at a lower rate than men in resistance training in the general population. This does not carry over to athletics. As soon as we get into the competitive sport domain, this is no longer the case. So in no way am I saying that being a woman is necessarily protective against injury. However, if we look at Globo Gym, the sport of ego lifting at your local LA Fitness is dominated by men. So you will see a higher injury risk in that population. Not a hill I'm ready to die on this next one, but from the limited research that I have seen, it looks like women will reap a greater benefit or greater cognitive benefit from exercise than men. Men are going to have much higher levels of muscle damage, so they probably don't recover from exercise as fast, so they can't probably train with the level of frequency that a woman can. And then substrate usage. Women use more fat during exercise than men. So a good little infographic here on the right if you want to just kind of see some of the differences between men and women. Pause the video at this point. As always, I included my references here at the end. For those that are interested in the references, I always keep these on hand. You know where to find me, at @the_squatfather on Instagram. I hope this was of value to you guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can reach out to me directly or just drop them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And as always, stay gifted.